Good morning, students of British and American culture. This lecture is coming to you a day late because we were trying to sort out textbook deliveries, but as far as I know, everybody has gotten their book. So we will be having the quiz on Thursday at 10 a.m. as we originally planned. I set that date last week. So you're going to receive a link to do the test, the quiz, over Google Forms in the next day. And you need to log in at 10 o'clock, and at 10:10 sharp, the quiz will be over and you have to submit your form by then. I explained this last week in our Zoom lecture. So here we are, back again. I want to talk about one thing that will be included on the quiz, which I neglected to talk about last week. Primarily, the information that is on the exam is from the introduction and only the sections that I pointed out to you. And the first four cultures of the first millennium. So we have the Celts first, basically what we refer to as the native culture of Britain, followed by the Romans, which they mix with the native Celtic culture to form this kind of hybrid group we called the Romano-Britons. Then the Anglo-Saxons, which are actually three Germanic groups, the Angles, the Saxons, and Jutes, but they form this kingdom eventually called the Anglo-Saxon kingdom from Wessex, which we talked about Alfred in the Zoom class. And then the Danes, which are the people, they're primarily from Denmark, and we refer to them as Danes, but they're the Viking people from Scandinavia. Some of them are actually Norwegian or Swedes, but the ones that settled in England primarily, they called them Danes, whether they came from Denmark or not. So those are the four cultures that you have to know, and I've already talked about them. And then we added Arthur, Alfred, and Canute last class as leaders of those respective cultures. And they each have their own stories, which the stories are in the book. Now, Boudica, whoops, small mistake there. Where's my marker? I believe Boudica is just one C, if I'm not mistaken. She was a queen. We call her Queen Boudica. She was the leader of one of the Britain people, a group of the Britain people. And when the Romans were there and they were taking over the area which they called Britannia, making a Roman province out of the southern part of the island. She was a leader, a female leader of one of the tribes, and the Romans took advantage of her family and attacked her daughters and abused them sexually. They were accused of rape, and as a result, she wanted to overthrow the Romans and push them back out of the area which is now England and restore, the tribes to their own territory. So she led a revolt which gathered thousands of Britons, warriors, and they went on a rampage and killed Roman citizens and Roman legionaries until the Romans were able to gather their forces and put down the revolt and punish all of the people who revolted. So that is the story of Queen Boudica, and she's a Celtic figure, and she's a woman in addition to that. So it's important that I don't skip over her. There's only a really brief caption about her in the book, but you can read about it. There's a statue that commemorates her near the Parliament buildings in London, in Westminster, and it's right beside the subway station. You can actually see the sign for the Underground in the corner there. And she led that revolt against the Roman overlords in Britannia. It was unsuccessful, but it was a really serious event that almost succeeded in removing the Roman presence in around London and southern England. So she's an important figure, not only because she represents the Celts as a culture and a group and their resistance against Roman oppression, but also, of course, because she was a female leader, perhaps the first female leader that we could call British. And we're going to talk about others. There are lots of famous women, especially Queen Elizabeth is going to come up. Queen Elizabeth I is going to come up when we get to the 16th century. So looking forward, it's good to set a precedent and include a woman in our discussion. Now that's the end of the material that is going to be on the quiz. So from now on, I'm going to start talking about the Normans. That's what's going to be the rest of the lecture for today, as I'm going to talk about the Normans, and then we're going to move forward next lecture into some other things like what it was like to be a peasant in England after the Normans invaded, the changes in language, and the things like the Black Death, and the way that the English participated in the Crusades. And the Normans have a lot to do with all of these things. So we'll just talk about the Normans from now on, but remember, William the Conqueror, the last person in the list here, and the Normans are not on the quiz on Thursday. So we're talking about moving forward here, and we're going into chapter 2. This chapter is not very long, so we should be able to cover the whole thing over the next 2 lectures. 1066 is the year that the Norman invasion occurred, and that is one of the numbers you have to remember. I said at the beginning of the course, I don't really care about remembering specific dates. This is not a history course, and the course doesn't revolve around specific dates, but this is the most important date in English history. Everybody knows it, and everybody gets taught about it. So this is something I think that you need to know too. So any English kid, or British kid for that matter, is going to know that in 1066, a people from northern France, from a place called Normandy, invaded, and that changed everything. There's actually a book which I have called 1066, the year that changed everything. The reason it changed everything is because the culture and the government and the beliefs and the language of these people that came from Normandy were different. So let me explain just how this situation happens. The last king of the Anglo-Saxons is Harold Godwinson, and he becomes the king because the king before him, his name is Edward, he was unable to have children. So when he died, there was no son for him to pass on the throne to. So the next king had to be chosen, and the group of English people called the Witan, it's like a council of important English people, Anglo-Saxon people. They decided that this Anglo-Saxon magnate, an important lord, he was an earl actually, that he would become the next king. So he was crowned Harold Godwinson. His brother's name was Tostig, and Tostig was given sort of control over northern England. Oh, sorry. My phone started to move on its own. He was given control of the northern part of England, the area that had been controlled by Vikings, by the Danes, and was sort of a mixture between the Germanic culture and the Danish culture. So you can think about northern England as being a little bit different, as it still is, than the area around London and Kent and Wessex. So northern England was this different sort of place, and when Tostig went up there, they didn't like him, and so Harold sort of demoted him from his position as Earl of the area of northern England. When that happened, his brother decided to make friends with a Danish king. And then this Danish king, and we won't worry about, I'm going to end up using too many names, so we won't worry about his name, but a Danish king and Tostig. Tostig's the more important one, I think, really. I believe the Viking's name was Hardrada. And they started to invade northern England. So Harold responded by marching up north and fighting these Vikings. He ended up surprising them and killing most of them or driving them back to their ships. So this was a very important event, because when Harold did that, this whole period of almost 300 years of Viking invasions is ended. There's never a large invasion. They don't have to worry about the Vikings so much after this. So you can imagine like a country that's basically living in fear all the time, especially if you live near the coast, you live near the sea, that any time a Viking ship would appear and attack your village or your town, and you'd have to try and defend yourself or run away. But this period is, the period of large armies invading is done, and the raids will decrease from now on. So when Harold destroys this army, it's the end of the Viking major influence over England. So that period is done. And that's why we sort of have this kind of order here. The Viking period is over. And this happens in 1066. Now, simultaneously, as the Vikings are trying to invade England from the north, William the Bastard, because his mother was not a princess, was not a highborn lady. His father was a duke, the Duke of Normandy. He, through his own ability and strength and intelligence, managed to become the duke, even though he was not a high-level ranking person. He managed to defeat all the other potential people to take the rank, and then he became the Duke of Normandy. There's a story that he was promised by Harold that Harold would support his application for the throne of England if Edward was not able to have an heir. He was not able to have a child. Nobody really knows whether that is true or not, but definitely there was a strong connection between William and the kings of England, because his great-grandmother, one of his ancestors, was Queen of England. So he is actually related distantly to Edward, the king who died. And Harold isn't. Harold is an Anglo-Saxon, important Anglo-Saxon person, but he's not related to the former king of England, but William is. So he claims that he should be the king, not Harold. So he's trying to get across the English Channel, the narrow body of water that's between France and England, but the winds are not helping him go the right direction. They're blowing against his ships, so he can't move, and the Vikings get there first. So Harold fights the Vikings, but as soon as he defeats the Vikings, a couple weeks later, the winds change, and William decides, not even a couple weeks later, shortly after that, within a couple weeks, he's able to get in his ships and cross to England. And he lands in the southern part of England. And Harold decides, although he's already sent most of his soldiers, been trying to send them back to their farms because this is harvest season, he recalls everybody and he quickly marches back down south to fight William. And they meet at a place called Hastings. And in that battle, Harold is killed, probably by an arrow to his eye. And when he dies, basically the English army runs. The Anglo-Saxons run away. The remaining ones run away, and William wins the battle. After he wins the battle, he marches around London, attacking different places and burning things until the people of London surrender. And this is called the Norman Conquest. So what happens after that? Well, William goes to London and goes to, at Christmas, he becomes the new King of England. The thing is that he doesn't speak English, he speaks French. His ancestors are a mixture. The Normans are essentially a group of Vikings that over the past 100 years, just like in England, they moved to northern France. And the King of France allowed them to live there if they changed their religion to Christianity, and they promised to support the King of France. So the Duke of Normandy is kind of half Viking, half French. He's a genetically mixed, but culturally more French than anything else. So he comes there, and he is Christian, and so he has a connection to the Catholic Church, and he's a warrior, just like most of the Normans are. They end up going all over Europe and taking all kinds of territory from different places. And William is one of the most successful ones. He takes over the Kingdom of England, and when he becomes king, he initially tries to work with the Anglo-Saxons and tries to learn English, but there's a lot of resistance to him, and there's some rebellions, especially in the north. And so after a few years, he's had enough. So he marches up north and destroys, burns everything, kills all the boys and men he can find, and destroys all the food and the plants and the farms, so that what's left over is just people without anything to eat, and they end up starving. This is called the Harrying of the North. And this sets the stage for a sort of suppression of English culture. So initially, really, there's only something like 5,000 to 10,000 Normans that come over with William, and he rewards them with lands, and he gives them treasure, and he gives them servants and all that kind of stuff that you would get when you win a war. But after the English don't respect his status as the king, and he has to brutally suppress all those people, he decides that he's just going to strip all of the English of their land. So you end up with more people coming from Normandy, tens of thousands of people, probably something like 10 or 15% of the population, maybe 20% of the population of England becomes Norman. Not enough to get rid of the English language or change the culture dramatically, but enough so that they can control the whole country. And they do this by bringing all these Norman people over. They all speak French, and they're all Catholic, just like the English, but they have a different way of organizing their churches. So he gets rid of all of the bishops and all of the people from the church that are English, and he replaces them with Normans. So basically the Church of England and the government and the land all becomes property of the Normans. And he says he becomes instantly the greatest landowner probably in the world at the time, because he declares that the entire Kingdom of England belongs to him personally. And then he hands it out to his followers piece by piece. He keeps about 20% of it for himself, and 25% of it goes to the church. So you can imagine how disruptive this would be. It's basically the same idea as when Japan came to Korea in the early 20th century and tried to colonize Korea. They wanted to change everybody's language, and they wanted to re-educate people. And all of the positions, all the important positions, were occupied by Japanese officials. And in this day and age, the equivalent of that would be to give the ownership of the land to the Normans, and to give the roles in the church, which were very important, all to Norman people. So he changed the whole system because the Anglo-Saxons sort of ruled by consensus. The king was like the leader of this powerful, rich group of nobles. There was these important people all over England, and together with the approval of those powerful people, the king would rule. But this is not how William the Conqueror ruled, or William the Bastard, if you prefer. He decided that all the power would be directly in his person. So all of the people, instead of, following local groups of people, they all had to swear loyalty to him. And this is more of like an absolute power situation for a king to have. Something more like a dictator would have, and rather than something like a typical king the type of power a typical English king or European king would have at the time, which would be with the agreement of the other powerful people, he would be the leader, and they, through their influence over other people, he would be the greatest among them. But this is not what William did. He wanted direct loyalty and power related to him. So we're going to talk about other kings later, and a lot of other kings really want to have this power that William had. He actually had it, and he had the power to basically control anybody in the country because of his reputation and because of his connections to each person. So all of the soldiers, all of the nobles, and all of the clergy basically owed William. Everything they had was given to them by him, and he could take it away. So that's the way England became afterwards. And looking backwards, a more democratic, equal, opportunity country obviously looks at William as not a very positive influence on the development of the culture. So that's something that later people would call the Norman yoke. A yoke is a very heavy thing you use to carry, buckets or weight on your shoulders. So the Norman yoke is like all of the English people having a burden on their shoulders from the Normans. So what are the greatest influences? That political situation, that cultural change. William gave up on learning English. As I said, when he first came to England, for about 2 or 3 years, he was trying to do things in English. But once he had rebellions and people disrespecting him and fighting against his men and his rule, he, I suppose in some ways justifiably, got really angry and punished them and refused to use English. He just gave up on it completely. From that point on, everything was done in French. So everything in the court, everything in the government, everything in the church was done in Latin, and everything in the court, in the kingdom that was official news or documents or laws or proclamations, everything was done in French. So this is one of the reasons why, as I told you, English is so complicated. You can see the influence on our language from these different cultures. That's one reason that we know, even though many of the things that they made and the things that they did have been lost, like we don't have any clothing because things, disintegrate. We have architectural evidence that we dig up things, and we have tools and weapons and graves and bones and stuff like that. But the majority of the culture disappears. But the imprint on the language has not disappeared. So you can see, obviously, Latin is the language of the church, and Latin was the language of the Romans. So it's got a huge influence on the language and the vocabulary of English. Old English is the language of the Anglo-Saxons, and that was originally a Germanic language. So English is actually in the Germanic branch, the Germanic language group, because of that. So the basic structure of English is Germanic. And it loses some of the elements of Germanic languages, but at its core, it's still Anglo-Saxon, a German language. Then you have all this vocabulary I mentioned to you last class about the pronouns, for example, the character thorn, and calling somebody them, or referring to these or those. Those are Danish sounds. And those are words that have come down to us through the Viking influence. But the most significant influence on our language was French, Old French, the language of William the Conqueror and the Normans, which was actually used by all of them as their first language. And everything that had to be announced to the people. If you wanted to get ahead, if you wanted a government job, like, not a government job in the sense that we talk about it now, like a stable job that has a good pension, but getting a job as an official in the court, to have influence on decisions that are made in your country. If you wanted to be one of those people, you had to learn French. French was the language of high culture. That's why we have so many words that are related to, for example, food and fashion, because that vocabulary was used to describe those things. And when we want to sound fancy, we use that French vocabulary in English. right? A lot of those words, that's where they come from. So you can see how important and the lasting effect, even though after a few hundred years, the Norman character of the kings and queens is also going to slowly diminish. After not even that many generations, after a few generations, there's going to be a king who speaks English rather than French. It takes a couple hundred years to get to that point where the king is speaking French as a second language rather as a native speaker. But it gets to that point after a couple hundred years. And we'll see some examples in language again of how that plays out. Now, the last thing I want to talk about today, I'll probably add a little bit because the clock is ticking here. But as we talk about the Middle Ages in England, and that is the period where the Norman kings have the greatest influence on English culture. Part of the way that the Normans were able to control the country so well, as I said, is because of this relationship to the king. But still, people would have not listened, especially to basically a foreign occupying, colonizing king. I'm sure most of the Anglo-Saxons preferred to have one of their own people leading them, and that the last thing they wanted to do is just follow orders from this foreign Norman person in London. But they had no choice because, as it shows in the textbook here on page 67, that's a Norman castle. It's called a Norman castle because it's a small square stone building. And some of them were not stone, but there was roughly 500 of these castles built in England, about one every 15 or 20 kilometers across the entire country. And you can think of this sort of like a really scary police station. The purpose of those castles was to keep order, to make things safe, right? It doesn't matter who's attacking, Vikings or Scottish people or Irish people or somebody from northern France. Anybody is trying to attack, those castles will allow you to protect the countryside. But more than that, it meant that the English people themselves, if they wanted to protest or they wanted to fight back, that the Normans could use that castle to prevent them from fighting. And there was about 500 of these castles built. Less than 100 of them were stone, but they were all intimidating and very, very strong structures to fight from. So in the whole history of this era, 500 castles were built. Only one, which apparently wasn't really completely built and was overwhelmed really quickly, only one was ever taken by English peasants, by a peasants' revolt, and that was in the very north of England, and that was one of the things that sent William off on this rampage to punish the English, so that he gave up on trying to adapt to the culture, and just insisted on the Norman language, the French language, and the Norman culture, and the hierarchy of the church, and all the things that would secure his power. So after they took this one castle, about 3 years after Hastings, they never took another one again. So these castles, to the English people, the Anglo-Saxons, which were 80% of the population, upwards of 80% of the population, these were symbols of oppression, not symbols of safety. So you can't really call them police stations in the normal sense, because we usually look at a police station and think that's something that helps the neighborhood be safe. Although, I should add, since we're talking about British and American culture, these days, for example, in the United States, there is cases of police brutality and violence, which makes the citizens afraid, especially certain groups of people. And the BLM movement is all about that. So maybe there is a stronger connection between, the oppression of a police station in a locality. And some people feel safe by that, just like in America, there are good police officers. So there is proximity to a police station is usually a good thing because that neighborhood is safe. But there's all these people that potentially, if they disagree with the government or they have a problem and they want to protest, then it's going to be blocked by the presence of a police station. And that's essentially what the Norman castles were. They were buildings that were used to keep people under control, whether they wanted to be controlled or not. Okay? So we will move forward. We're going to talk about the Crusades and talk about religion more, because Christianity doesn't start to play a big role until the Anglo-Saxons decide to change their religion to Christianity. So we're going to sort of go back in time a little bit and go through things a little bit more topically. So I'm going to talk about the Crusades and how religion is so important to English life from the ancient times right up until the present, really. And then I'm going to talk about, how the transformation from Norman culture into the Normans sort of get absorbed. And then there's these terrible events. Starvation from famine, because they don't have enough food and the climate is changing. The Black Death. And an uprising in England again called the Peasants' Revolt. And those are the topics that we will cover in the next class. So remember, don't worry about the Norman stuff. That's not on the quiz. That's for the next one. And that's the rest of the material. I will be recording again on Thursday and uploading the second half of this week's lecture. For now, please read the sections of the book that I've been covering in the lectures and prepare yourself for a short quiz on Thursday. Not anything to be stressed out about. As I said, I'm only going to count the top 5 out of your 6 quizzes over the semester. So if mistakes are made, that's okay. All right. I will see you on Thursday. And please remember that you need to be very punctual to get your quiz done during the 10 minutes that you're given. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.